Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm super excited to host this webinar session. As I mentioned earlier, there's a QR code here for the Mentimeter, and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, the community board that you live in or are interested in applying to, and why you're interested. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. Awesome. So thank you so much for joining. My name is Emily Chingay. I am the citywide engagement advocate here at Open Plans. With us here today, we have Sarah Lind. Sarah, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. Um,
Yes. Hey, everybody. Sarah Lind. I'm co-executive director at Open Plans. So excited to have you all here. And I was on my community board, CB7 in Manhattan, for 6 years, but no longer am. So excited to share some of my tips and tricks when we get there in the presentation. Thank you.
Amazing. And then we also have our amazing guest speaker, Roz. Thanks so much for being here. I think you're muted, Roz. Sorry.
Um, okay, yeah, here we go. My name is Roz Junitzis. I'm live in Sunnyside, Queens, and I'm entering my fifth year as a member of CB2 Queens. And I am on the executive committee, meaning I'm first vice chair. However, I am speaking today totally as an individual, and that's one thing you'll learn. Cardinal rule: the only person who can speak for a community board is the chair or the chair's designate.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So a little bit about Open Plans for folks that are new here. We are a nonprofit here in the city advocating for safer streets and equitable public spaces in all neighborhoods. We do this through grassroots advocacy and policy change to really inspire these structural reforms and cultural shifts. So a couple of our campaigns include advocating to lift parking mandates in the city, helping schools apply for school streets for outdoor learning and safer pickup and drop off. And then, of course, community boards, helping community board members by supporting them to pass resolutions in their board, but also encouraging folks to become more involved in their neighborhood, apply to their board, and give them some tips and tricks. So that's really why we wanted to host this webinar session today, to share what it really means to be a community board member, along with some insider tips from some board members. So after the presentation, we'll also have an opportunity for Q&A. So definitely feel free to start typing your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll answer them later on. So let's jump right in. So what is a community board? They are advisory boards here in the city made up to 50 members who are volunteers, and they are nominated by either city council or their borough president, and then ultimately appointed by their borough president. Community board members, next slide, sorry. Community board members serve 2-year terms, and as of 2019, they're term limited to 4 2-year terms. And as community boards have a budget, and this budget helps cover salaries for a district manager, maybe a community coordinator or an assistant. And their main responsibility is to receive any, help with any complaints or concerns from the community. So that might include maybe if there's an issue on your block that you would like to help resolve, you can always go to your community board. They're a really great resource for that. Next. Amazing. So why do they matter? Why are community boards important? So when it comes to these really big community or even citywide decisions, it's really a small group of folks on the board that are making decisions for hundreds of thousands of people. So city agencies, elected officials, they often look to community boards for their stamp of approval, and they really uh, are influenced by their feedback and what they have to say. So it's really important that we get strong voices on the board and make sure that they're making decisions that are reflective of the whole neighborhood. That kind of leads us to our current issue with community boards, which is that they're often not reflective of their respective neighborhoods. So a lot of times board members, they might be wealthier, they might be like car owners or maybe homeowners, and not really not maybe racially reflective of the community. And because of this lack of representation, it's often board members that are making decisions that might favor just the folks on their board and not so much the whole community. This is definitely not always the case, but it is one of the big issues with community boards right now. And that's where you all come in. So if you're ready to get involved in your community and be more engaged, one of the best ways to do this is by attending a monthly board meeting or a committee meeting and staying in the loop with what's going on in your neighborhood. City agencies are often giving presentations to board members and giving them kind of like the inside scoop of what's going on, and project timelines, things like that. So it's a great way to stay involved and stay engaged. And if there's anything in particular that stands out to you that you would love to speak in support of, there is an opportunity for a public session at full board meetings. So you can kind of speak anything that's on your mind during this time, any concern that you have in the community, or if you want to just highlight a topic or neighborhood initiative. It's also a really great opportunity to speak in support of resolutions during committee meetings. Folks will have the opportunity to support a resolution or speak against it, depending on the reso. So it's a great way to kind of show that you care. And then another really great way is to support local community groups that are presenting at these board meetings. So maybe, for example, your favorite open street group is presenting to your board, and you really want to show the board members that you care about this, that your whole neighborhood cares about the open street. You can definitely ask your friends to show up and support at these meetings. It really helps influence board members, ensure that just the whole community cares. And if you're ready to take the next step but are kind of unsure about the commitments of being a full board member, definitely consider being a public member. This isn't always an option, so definitely check with your board first to confirm. But this is a great way to see really what it means to be a board member. You get to sit on a committee, and yeah, and then if you're ready to take the next step and you've done all of this and you really want to be a part of your community, definitely consider applying to your community board. So what does it mean to be a board member? So as a board member, you are kind of the eyes and ears of the community. You're listening to what your neighbors need, and you're working to make real change in your neighborhood. So city agencies and elected officials are always giving presentations. They're always talking about neighborhood projects at these board meetings, and you have the opportunity to ask questions, to help make decisions for your community. And some of these presentations that city agencies will give might include something for a public plaza or a bike lane, or maybe even a pedestrian study, for example. So it's a great way to make sure that you're getting all your questions answered and you're doing the best that you can for your neighborhood. Next slide. So here are a couple expectations as a community board member. So as a board member, you're expected to sit on at least one committee, and sometimes two. Each committee usually meets monthly, and then there's also your full board meeting. So around 3 meetings a month. These meetings are on weekday evenings with a break in July and August, and then also sometimes they will go on break in December, January, depending on the board. But being a community board member means being a public speaker. So you won't be expected to do host presentations or anything big like that at your board. But when you're going to these meetings, be ready to participate, be active, ask questions, listen to what others have to say. And while you're participating, definitely remember to stay true to your principles and really ground your beliefs in data. Not everyone on the board is going to have the same point of view as you do, and that's totally okay. But definitely remember to, remain open and empathetic, listen to others, really make the most of your time there, and try to be as productive as you can in these meetings because they can be a little long sometimes. So here are some roles and responsibilities. One of the really great things about being a community board member is that you have the opportunity to discuss resolutions or neighborhood initiatives. So maybe you hear, for example, that your neighbors are concerned about the trash in your area and you would love some trash containerization. You can ask the Department of Sanitation for trash containerization, or maybe, for example, you might want safer streets, safer intersections, you can ask the DOT for universal daylighting in your community. And the process is more, so for the process, you can ask your chair. The chair has a lot of flexibility of what goes onto the agenda. Once it's on the agenda, the committee will have an opportunity. There will be a presentation. They'll have an opportunity to vote, to ask questions. And since they are seen as the experts of the committee, at the community board, sorry, depending on how they vote, the full board generally tends to vote the same way. This isn't always the case, but since they are the experts, that's usually what tends to happen. But it's a really great way to take what you're hearing in your community, what's being discussed, and bringing that to your board for a discussion and maybe even a resolution from there. Next slide. Amazing. So I'm going to pass this over to Sarah and Roz now for some insider tips from community board members.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Emily. An amazing presentation on community boards. So I saw, in the chat, some questions about how to improve your chances or of getting appointed to a board. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I think probably in the Q&A, we can really dive into more, tips and tricks and about the experience of being on a board. So first of all, before you even apply, there's a lot you can do to increase your chances. And I will say, even though applications are open now and due relatively soon, it's not too late to do these things for this year. So you could kind of start now, but also if you're thinking of maybe applying in a year, also start these things now. So I think probably one of the most important things, honestly, is just attending the community board meetings, because you'll really understand what they do. You'll understand sort of at least a little bit of the politics of that board. And in the application, usually they'll ask you if you've attended meetings. And if you say no, that's kind of like, okay, probably not a good chance of getting onto the board if you've never attended a meeting.
Can I add a little more to that? Could I amplify a little on that? Because I think you can often view community board meetings remotely through YouTube, but if you go and, if you have an opportunity to do public comment, be visible a bit and talk to people. But I also find there are a lot of people apply to community board for the wrong reason. They may think it's a position of great power. There's a little power, but not a lot. But they, and then they discover after they come for a meeting or two, and then they never show up again. And we really want to avoid that. So if you go, you'll know what you're in for. And that's really important, and including the committee meetings. I'd like also, I know in the chat, I saw Sarah Peters was asking about if their meetings are all in person. And technically, they should be because of the open meetings law, unless the board has gotten permission and figured out a budget to run in somewhat of a hybrid format. That exception to the open meetings law was put into place at the beginning of COVID, and it's going to sunset during the summer. What I would like to say is that we hope that this will be expanded. I don't know, maybe I hope, let me speak just for me, but many people realize that There are lots of reasons why it's hard to show up in person for a meeting. And if we restrict ourselves to in-person meetings, we're also not going to have the broad participation in the community that we like. So anyway,
Yeah.
that I just want to those comments.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I agree on my board. As I was leaving, we were debating in person or virtual, and there's pros and cons of each. But I do agree with your point that if you're thinking of applying, going in person is really good to really see the ins and outs of how it works. Okay, so other ways, just before you even apply to, increase your chances, just getting involved in your community. Obviously, if you're looking to be on the community board, you're saying that you want to represent the community. So it's important that you have a good sense of what the needs are. Your neighbors, some of the important groups in your community, some of the community-based organizations, nonprofits, other groups that are doing important work in the neighborhood, so that, if they come to a community board meeting, you're familiar and who they are and what they do. So that's always really good. Also, just good in general. And then this community boards are a political body. They are, an official part of New York City government. You are appointed by your council member and or your borough president. The borough president has final say over all appointments. Technically, the board is sort of divided in half. The borough president gets 25 and the council member gets 25, but at the end of the day, the borough president has the final say. So get to know them. If a council member is looking through a stack of applications and sees a name they know, and they know that person has, showed up at meetings and been involved in things, they're just naturally going to think this person is, a good neighborhood representative. If they see a name they've never heard before, it's going to be a little harder to get to the top of the pile. So for that, even just showing up at the community board meetings might help you with that, because sometimes they come. Sometimes only their representatives come. So in that case, get to know them, and they might be looking at applications too. But also if you're getting involved in your neighborhood and you're going to things, you might run into your council member there as well, because they're doing that too. So you'll have a lot of opportunities for that. And it's going to help your application. Next slide. So then in terms of the application itself, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute with just pressing the space bar, but one way I like to look at it is that you are selected by electeds. Because some people say, oh, the board should be elected. Well, that would be ridiculous, because we elect judges, and most of the time we have no idea who these people are. But so I guess very important to get to know, especially your council member. Each district, though, can run differently. And the year or so after I was appointed to the board, my council member, Jimmy Van Bramer, was running against Donovan Richards, who ultimately became. So, I don't know how cooperative there is right in the middle of the primary was, but in any event, start with your council member. They usually are fairly accessible, especially at community events.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then the application itself. So I believe they're all open. And so you can go look at them yourself, but there'll be various questions you have to fill out. A lot of them are just sort of demographic and easy. And then you will be asked to select committees of interest on most of the applications, I think, at least definitely in Manhattan. And this is sort of a way for the council member or the borough president to look at the makeup of the board right now and where there might be some gaps, and who might fill them. So the community board has a big role in land use, for example. And so there's often a desire to have people with at least some expertise in that on the board. Sometimes they like planners or architects, people just with a history in that, just so they can contribute a little bit more knowledge than just an average lay person. And so if they only, if they're like, oh, we're kind of missing that on the board right now, and they see someone with that who has an interest in that, that might, lift you to the top. You should not try to do that strategically. You should just list the committees you're actually interested in and hope that there's a need for it. But, and if you can kind of link it to any expertise you have. If you're a transportation planner and you want to be on the transportation committee, for example, that's going to show like, oh, this is someone who could provide value to the board. Highlight that community involvement you have been doing as you prepare to apply. And then there'll be sort of some long answers, kind of essays, more than just a few words, where you can explain your interest and explain, some of the issues you'd be interested in working on. At least when I applied in the Manhattan Community Board application, they had a question which was like, pick two, if there were two problems in the district you could solve, what would they be and how would you solve them, and people might take different approaches to this, but I picked like very specific ones rather than like affordable housing, which is, sure, we'd all like to solve that. I said, like, I'd like there to be more benches for seniors to sit on, and I'd like to improve the storm drains because we get big puddles like this morning with the snow. So think of things like that that show that, like, your neighborhood. What is the thing a community board actually works on? Community boards have impact on affordable housing, of course, but like in a more diffuse way than on, very specific neighborhood problems. So that would be my suggestion for that. But also, kind of a little bit contrary to everything I just said, also show that you're open to all the things that the community board works on. You might have expertise, you might have issues you're really interested in, but you're really interested in all the things they do. And they, different community boards do slightly different things. There's a few mandated roles they have, but then some community boards have a public safety committee, some don't. Some have, a youth committee, some don't. So you could also look at the committees that your board has and express interest in that as well. I think that's all we have for the presentation itself, and we're super excited to open it to Q&A. Emily, do you want to lead that? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see two questions in the chat, but folks, please feel free to ask anything in the chat. We'd love to bring you on as a panelist as well to answer your questions live. So let us know if you'd like to do that. But the first question is, are there any tricks of the trade on how to stay engaged during a long community board meeting?
I have to laugh at that. I wonder, Sarah, I wonder what you have to say. I think I shouldn't really even confess to this, but there you want to find the usually wherever you're meeting, there's a Wi-Fi link, and that may give you access to also in ways to communicate with other board members. One of the things that I would like to say, I found the first year I was on my board, I didn't know any of the board members, and I thought most of them disagreed with me probably. I don't know why I felt that way because that was wrong. And then by chance, I got to connect up with people. And that made all the difference in the world. And we are trying in our community board in Community Board 2 in Queens, which is Long Island City, Woodside, Sunnyside, and parts of Maspeth. We really want now to promote interaction amongst community board members, because this way you can plan and think ahead as to certain kinds of motions and come prepared to the meeting, and so on. But for reasons that I don't fully understand, that it seems, and this may be just specific to our community board, there was a great attempt to discourage that type of communication. And I made it my business. One of the benefits of having during COVID, meetings were all virtual. And so you could direct message people and say, hi, I'm Roz. This is my email and my phone. And would you like to have coffee or something like that? And what's your contact information. And so I got to meet a lot of people just doing that. It may be a little, you can do the same thing in person, I suppose. Um,
Yeah.
and that would, hopefully there'll be the leadership and so on will encourage that more. So
Yeah,
that's
I was actually going to say I totally agree with your point that having a virtual option is really important and will increase participation on the board. But I would say if there's an in-person option, go, and if you're able to go, because I do think you're able to develop those relationships more. I joined before COVID and was able to make a lot of connections with people on the board, and then during COVID this whole new class of people joined that I felt like I never really got to know. So yeah, I think that's helpful. But in terms of paying attention during meetings, I also think that going in person helps with that too, because, it's a little bit harder to like be looking at something on your computer if you're sitting in a room with people. And I would say that it kind of depends on the issue for me. Sometimes it's a more contentious issue and it's like, okay, I better pay attention and see what people have to say. On the other hand, I've sat through, half an hour long conversations about historic windows that I will admit are a little bit more difficult for me to pay attention to. So I don't know if we offered that much help, but you're not alone.
Amazing. Okay, so the next question is, should I apply to the community board where I live or where I work? And what factors should I consider when making this decision?
Oh, I think that's a tricky one because, um, it depends a little bit. If you want to be the voice crying in the wilderness and in the minority and you get a sense of the tone and flavor of the board, or you want to be with a board where you're going to find a lot of people that agree with you, and how do you figure that out? Uh,
I think it kind of depends too, like what is your work? Do you own a small business in the board? Then that might really make sense. If you work in Midtown at a random, business there and you're thinking of applying to CB5, that I guess might make sense too. But if you live somewhere more neighborhoody, that might make more sense. So I would probably weigh that. And like, is your whatever you do for work highly affected by the community board, or is it sort of like tangential? I think those would be things that I would think about. I will say, I do think that there is interest among probably not all, but many council members in appointing people who work in the districts. I don't think that many people apply in the districts that they work in rather than live in. So I'm not positive about that, but I think there could be some benefit to that, I suppose.
I think that's an interesting point, and I don't quite know the answer to it. We've been finding that with regard to businesses, there are some business improvement districts, and we're trying to also have social events that, with them, and especially because some of them might be restaurants that offer us a few snacks as well, meeting and a place to meet, or whatever. Um, so
Sorry, one thing I want to say before I forget about the last question. When you were describing that you had to kind of DM people for their contact information, so crazy to me because for CB7 in Manhattan, we send out, once a year, a full list of the board's contact information to everyone on the board. And I think
huh,
it's a good example of how different boards can be. There are very few, like I said, there's some very specific charter mandated, roles of the board and a few kind of like things that they have to have in their bylaws and do. But other than that, it's very up to the board to decide how they run themselves. And it can be really different, which is another reason to to know your board before you apply.
that's an excellent point, Sarah. I have made a note of that because, uh, I have a feeling a lot in the community board, there is a district manager and other people in the office, but the district manager can have a big influence. And sometimes they'll say things like, well, you're going to come and go now that we have term limits. but we're going to be here. And there's a lot of power in that, and it's a little frustrating. And I think this is part of that discouraging us to get together has been in connection with that. So, yeah, I mean, the district manager the other day accused me of holding illegal meetings. And then I went to the open meetings law and I found, hey, it says that, subgroupings and caucuses and such are exempted from the open meetings law. Huh?
Yeah.
I didn't hear her
Yeah,
say, oh, I'm
there's
sorry, I was mistaken, but,
yeah. There's a lot of like Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary procedure that you will get to learn on a community board for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that leads us to kind of our next question in the chat from Sarah, which is there a centralized space where you can see the upcoming board meeting schedule and locations? And that really kind of depends on the board that you live in and that you're part of. Definitely check your board website. A lot of the times they will have an agenda or they'll have a calendar of upcoming meetings. And if there isn't any, if it's not updated, definitely call your board, call your district manager, or you can email them to get.
They are required by law to post these things and with 7 days at least notice in advance with the agenda. The agenda may change, but that is part of the requirement. So if they're not doing it, they're not following the rules, which of course never
That said, they don't
happens.
always do it.
Yeah, but we have on community board too, where our website on the one hand, we think leaves a lot of room for improvement. However, one of the helpful things has been to have a calendar and you can subscribe to different committees or whatever, and that will trigger you get informed of what committees are meeting when, what the agenda is, and so on. And then you can also link to the minutes of the meetings. Our minutes also link to a YouTube video for the full board so that you can actually hear if there's a specific subject that you wanted to see what the discussion was. Um, and so definitely that's the way things are moving in the future. I would like to say one thing about the term limits also, because we have people on our board who were on the board before some of the members of the board were born, which is outrageous. And one particular member, and this is going to change. It's interesting because I came on the board 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I guess I'm in my fifth year, and that was when the term limits was passed. And so when I walk off the cliff, so will that guy that's been on the board for over 40 years, and things will change. But one of the things we're trying to do in the leadership of our board also is to appoint people to committees, to have a chair and a vice chair, and to bring new members in and have them kind of that's a pathway forward. The committees are the incubators for thoughts and ideas and so on. So it's an important role. Uh, and that's where when you start out, that's certainly where you have to go to the full board meetings, but you want to go to the committees. And the first, if you get appointed, the first couple of months, go to different committees if you haven't already, so that you'll have an informed and speak out to the chair of the committee, because the chair may see that you could be a very helpful member, and that will have some sway. The chair, when I say the chair of the committee, the chair of the full board in most cases has the authority and the sole power to appoint people to committees. Although again, that could vary from board to board, so I'm not sure.
Amazing. So I see a question in the chat, in the Q&A from Cassandra, and that is, what is the approximate monthly time commitment as a board member?
So, if you assume you have two committees and the full board meeting, I think it really varies by board and how involved they are. On CB7 in Manhattan, a full board meeting could regularly run 3 to 4 hours. And then a committee meeting 2 to 3 hours. So then you're talking about, I mean, you could be up to 10 hours a month right there. If you're putting in some time before or after meetings to understand the issues and, think about how you're going to vote on things, which I think you should as an engaged and good board member, that adds a few more. And then if you really want to get involved, you might get an executive position. I was a secretary of the board. There's other executive board. You might want to be a chair of a committee. Then you might have to go to the steering committee. It varies. I think you could make it not that much, or you could make it a lot.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. Although we only require one committee meeting, many times our committee meetings are virtual, and we are sort of, I think on thin ice a little bit on that account because they say you cannot vote unless you have an in-person meeting. Now, during COVID, when we had the emergency declaration pandemic, different story. But because of that, um, what we do with certain committees, like I'm on Health and Human Services, which on our board has it needs some love, a lot of love, and we can make recommendations. And so on Community Board 6, they tell me they call these briefs or briefings. So you don't vote, you offer a briefing, and then that whatever that is brought to the full board which does meet in person invariably, and that will make it official. I'm hoping all of this will change, but in the short term, it's been the way we've come to accept it. I've fought long and hard for, or I should say, I advocated for loosening these rules because, I mean, for me, I'm an older person and I have some medical issues, which I shouldn't be exposing myself, especially in a small conference room with loads of people. And so I always am wearing my mask.
Yeah. Another quick thing that I wanted to mention is that maybe it might be helpful to do a little bit of homework before your meeting if you see that there's something in the agenda that you might not be too familiar with. Just reading up on it so that you have all your questions prepared and you can make it super productive. So I see another question that says the presentation also mentioned becoming a public member of a community board. So I'd love to kind of explain what that could entail.
Yeah, so not all boards have this. It's, some have it as an option that you can sort of become a member, sometimes just of a committee, where you can participate in the discussion on the terms that members participate. So usually at a committee meeting, the committee members will have like more of an open discussion, and they might open it up for public, comments from the public. So you'd be more on level with the committee members, and you might be able to have a vote that wouldn't impact the outcome, but at least you were still sort of expressing yourself. I think different boards do it differently, and so you'd have to see if your board has it. Does yours have it?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure how long this has been in effect across the other boards, but I know on our board it started about 2 years ago. We really only had one solicitation. We're about to renew that and formalize it a little more. It's if first of all, if you don't get on the full board and you have applied, definitely try to do a public member. And they call it somewhat different. There are different terms that are used. But to me, if I were the borough president and I saw that somebody's been a public member, unless they've been a pain in the ass public member, which isn't always a bad thing, but they but they to me that would be a pathway. I mean, it would be a very strong uh, recommendation that yes, I was a public member, and yes, I went to the meetings and I participated. You have to find your style. The issue of participation is a tricky one because I know my first year I didn't say anything and or very little, and and I know some of our members who are very thoughtful and have contributed a tremendous amount in leadership, and they facilitate committees very well, but they never speak up and on issues and. Um, but I
Yeah.
think you have to find your style. There are also the other people who feel it's almost like the community board meeting is a dialogue between
Yeah.
them and the rest of the committee. That we
Yeah.
don't, we'd rather not have.
Yeah. One thing I realized that I don't think we mentioned, and it goes to being a public member or just showing up a lot, is sometimes a vacancy will open up in the middle of the year. And if they have to fill something like that, they're often going to be looking at, is there a public member who could step in? Is there someone who's been attending a lot? So again, even if you don't get appointed this year, it's worth continuing to show up.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, Sarah, because I have never seen um, a resignation and we had a guy who was made a judge a month after he was appointed to the board. So he showed up for one meeting, but his space has been unfulfilled. And actually, in I've been recently going back to the legal foundation in the charter and then the bylaws and so on. And they're supposed to fill those, but I've never seen it. So I think different, boroughs probably work differently. But I think it's a good point. I've tried to urge um, the council member when Jimmy Van Bramer, who had appointed me, um, you know, take a waiting list, have a few people there that if they didn't make it, but designate them as waiting list members so they could be used for this purpose. So maybe that's a change we should work on.
Amazing. So this is a question for Sarah and Roz, and that is, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned as a community board member, or any skills that you learned along the way and that you can maybe take to your next endeavor?
Well, you certainly learn the skill of communicating with people you don't agree with. I think you will never be an effective community board member if you're not able to do that. Listening to people who disagree with you and speaking respectfully about your opinions. And obviously that's important in life always. You'll learn a lot about your neighborhood and a lot about the city and how it works and some of the intricacies of city government. Um, you will learn a lot about land use, something I did not know that much about before I joined, and it's actually very, very important. Yeah, I don't know. Rosalind, what about you?
I struggle with that part of working effectively with people I don't agree with, but I do find that and everything you said about learn. I mean, especially land use. Oh my gosh, it's very technical, and uh, not everything has to be your strength. One of the things that I see working very effectively some of the time is a command of data and evidence. So if you're interested in street safety, definitely use Crash Mapper and and be able to say, well, in this area, or after we put in the bike boulevard, we went from, you know, 7 injury causing crashes in this area down to 0 or 1. And then at other times, do just the opposite and cite, for instance, we were concerned, for instance, I think one of our biggest is in a way successes, but I live right on the border of the Northern Boulevard corridor that comes out of Queens is just full of car dealerships and car stuff. And the last thing in the world we want is more cars in our city, in our neighborhood. And so there was a restaurant that had been in an area that was zoned residential, but it was out of business for quite a while. And it was had it therefore came to our attention when they wanted to put a Lincoln dealership there, a boutique Lincoln dealership. And it even got through the land use committee, and they said, "Oh, we need chargers, and we need trees." And I was, texting people I knew. That's lipstick on a pig. Don't do, this. We don't want this. And we were able to get this turned down. We had a lot of support from our council member ultimately because we're just advisory. But and one of the arguments why I'm saying this was so I asked the advocates, they're going to sell only SUVs, and said, "Is that like the Dodge Durango?" Oh yes, and they cited whatever the model was, and, and so I said, "Do you realize that 10 blocks away from there, our neighbor Maycito was killed by a Dodge Durango coming out of the BJ's parking lot. We do not need any more, And I know that, that's sort of the anecdote opposite of the data driven, but you need both. And it whatever we ended up that one ended up being a contested it was a tight vote. The borough president, because this goes to the borough president, had supported it, but in a lukewarm way. And, he wanted union members and whatever to work there. And then when the council member spoke against it, and she advocated, her name is Julie Won, WON. She advocated for a broader visioning of this area in not just this one place. So now we are having a bunch of community meetings about revisioning Northern Boulevard. So that to me is exciting.
Yeah, it's amazing. So we have one more question before we wrap up our webinar, and that is if there is a meaningful experience that you've had while serving on your board, the most meaningful one.
Yeah, and sort of similarly, I saw a question like, was there something that you worked for and it, got passed? So mine would definitely be the Central Park West protected bike lane. Honestly, it's hard to remember now that it didn't used to be that, but it didn't. And we had been talking about it for years, and as is so often the case with street safety issues, it took someone dying, and a tourist from Australia, Madison Leiden, was killed on Central Park West, and while she was biking. And it became, our rallying cry for we have got to fix this. But similarly to what you were saying, it was very contested. We had public meetings with hundreds of people coming to talk about losing their parking. The committee vote and the full board vote were both, definitely not unanimous. But we got it done with a lot of advocacy, a lot of those kinds of conversations, talking to people who maybe didn't agree with us on everything, but could see this point. And yeah, I feel it was literally a life-saving change we got done as a community board and as advocates, and very, very meaningful. And that's, you can join the community board, you can sit through hours, maybe hundreds of hours that don't feel that meaningful, and then you can do something like that and feel like you've made a really, really big difference in the city. It makes it worth it.
Sarah, I didn't know I could blame you for that. I have to tell you, every week I have an appointment. I make home visits, and I have a client up on 92nd Street in Central Park West, and I ride my bike up there. And and from Sunnyside, Queens, I can get there with all protected bike lanes. One
That's
block.
amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
And all of
So,
those protected bike lanes went through a community board who
oh
had
yes,
members on it willing
and
to
the
fight for
ones
them.
in our area. That's why I got on the community board, because we were trying to get the Sunnyside, the 40 Skillman Avenue bike paths and 43rd Ave coming in and out of the city, which all the time, and it was a pain in the neck to be in a community board meeting because I didn't understand the rules and the way each community board meeting runs and so on will vary. But they were just being told, no, you can't talk. I want to say something on this issue. It's wrong, and so on. And so that motivated me to get on the board. But probably the one thing I did during that first year when I didn't speak up much was there's some they also will time public comment, and they had the timer on. This poor woman, she was probably a little bit nervous and didn't get to her point, and she'd waited 2 or 3 hours to give this public comment, and then the bell rang, and she was very frustrated, and she sort of walked off. Any board members have a question? I said, yeah, I do. And what's your question? What was it you wanted to tell us? So that was kind of fun. Um, but I mean, I'm a big advocate of community boards. It's really the true interface between the people and the government. And I don't struggle. I do struggle with that issue you were talking about, representing your community. I represent my community because I was selected, and I'd have a hard time advocating for something that I really, in my heart of hearts, didn't believe in. That maybe comes to that selection process or something instead. Um, I know
Yeah,
you.
I think it's a question of, always staying true to your beliefs and thinking about what the community needs that is like reflected in your beliefs, and then
Yeah,
bringing that to the board. Yeah.
I think so too. And I mean, I hope people will sign up, and even if you don't agree with some of the views we've expressed tonight, uh, it's uh, it's a great place to be, to really be community and get to know what's going on.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate everyone for joining our webinar series today. We will send a follow-up email shortly with some links, a recording, and would love to set up a time to meet with any folks that are interested in applying to their community board. Uh, Also want to encourage everybody to try to make it out to their next full board meeting to even consider speaking during the public session. It's a really great way to kind of feel out what it's like. So thank you all so much again for joining. We hope to stay in touch, and there will be a second session later on in the year that will follow up. We'll follow up with you all on that. Thank
Oh,
you.
sign up. If not this year, next year.
Absolutely. Thanks
Be
all.
Good night.